Okay, let's start. So good morning, everyone. For those of you who still don't know me, so I'm Chris Benet, and I'm here to chair the first of those parallel sessions for today. We are up against a very fierce competition with two other parallel sessions on social capital on conflict, but if there was a reward for the most original and intriguing title, I think this session will definitely win it. So here we're here to hear about aspiration and psychosocial dimension of resilience, programming against the intangible. So what is effectively that session about? So we've heard yesterday and even today earlier that effectively I think a major progress in our own understanding and conceptualization of resilience was a recognition that effectively resilience can be understood as a set of capacities. So we made some I think tremendous progress in the last 5 years in understanding and measuring resilience. But there's still a couple of big question mark up. In particular, I think we also recognized yesterday that even if we do acknowledge the nature of resilience, we're still very unclear on what of those different dimensions of capacities are important and in which context. A lot of people have been and are still looking at, in particular, issues of how important it is to diversify. There will be another parallel session later today on the importance of the diversification of livelihood in relation to resilience. We obviously know, or we have the gut feeling that human capacity is very important in relation to resilience. As I said, there's a parallel session right now on social capital. And as we all know, empirical study have already shown, assets and access to financial services seems to be another key element in building the resilience of people. But all of those are what I would call tangible element of resilience, something we kind of measure easily. And the question is there something beyond those? And effectively, even those empirical analyses that were looking at those tangible elements seems to agree that beyond those, there's something else. There's another dimension that is not captured when we simply look at how many livestock or how much education those people have. There's a more intangible, a more subjective dimension. And this is what this session is about, is pushing the frontier of what we have understood on resilience and explore something where we are probably less comfortable, which is, what about the issues of perception? But effectively, when we think of it, that seems obvious. All our decisions on a day-to-day basis are not simply based on fact, but on the perception that people have about those facts. And it seems therefore legitimate and logical that effectively when people make decisions in the aftermath or in preparation of a shock, that is not simply based on what they know about the reality, but how they perceive it. So this is what that session is about. It's about trying to explore some of those key, let's call it subjective dimension. We know some of them. Economists have already shown the importance of issues such as risk perception and risk aversion. But beyond those, we could probably, or it seems also very, I would say, logical to imagine that dimensions such as fatalisms, self-confidence, aspiration, or what some people call self-efficacy, which is basically the perception you have of your own ability to deal with actually adverse event, would be critical element that would actually influence the decision-making process of people around their response after a shock. So for that, we have 3 presentations which are actually quite complementary. First, Marco will look at the relation between the subjective element of well-being how people feel about their own well-being, and how that affects, or whether there's a correlation with some of the capacity on resilience at the household level. He will base his empirical analysis on data from Mauritania, Senegal, and Ethiopia as well. Then we got Alemayu, who has been working with some colleagues of him from IFPRI, but also from Oxford, for quite a while now on trying to measure aspiration, and how aspiration affect the ability of people making decisions around investment. And when we talk about resilience, that is obviously very relevant. And then we'll have Tim, who based, Alemayu will base his presentation on empirical data from Ethiopia as well. And finally, we've got Tim, who will look at this time the link between some indicators of aspiration and self-efficacy and the type of response that people put in place in relation to shock, and he will use data from Niger, Burkina Faso, and also Ethiopia. So with that, I will invite first Marco to give his first presentation. This one, of course. Yeah, this one. I should say, so each of those will have about 10 minutes, which should allow them to have a respectable time exchange between the audience and the speakers.
Okay, good morning once again. My name is Marco and I work for FAO and right, exactly. Is there any pair in the room? Okay, so first I want to thank Chris for the introduction, and I was considering, wanted actually to exchange a word with the team, but it was too far from me, saying we are here now pioneering and supporting subjective measures after being for many years supportive of the quantitative approach. But that's important because we have learned the lesson, and I must thank people like Chris, and I must thank also other people from ODI, with who we started this collaboration and these approaches in understanding how much relevant is both qualitative analysis and subjective measures, which can both be quantitative and qualitative, as you learn from people like Chris, in achieving a better understanding of resilience. This is fundamental. So all what I am going to present here is drawn from, as I mentioned here in the first slide of my presentation, is based on the evidence that we draw from 13 data sets and one idea. And the idea is that, yes, we have to somehow combine subjective and objective perception of resilience and social inclusion and well-being. So basically, we have two major areas of work where we are looking at. The first one is how do subjective perception of well-being and social inclusion can affect resilience. So in this sense, we are very much interested in understanding whether a household that perceives itself like being in a good moment with a good level of well-being, or a household that perceives itself like being included in a social environment, which is an enabling environment, which she can rely on. Say, for example, I know that I can send my kids to Chris when I have some problems or something like this, can help me making myself and my household more resilient. Is that real? Is that not real? That's the research question where we were starting. Another completely related but completely different area of work that we are starting digging into is how does subjective perception of resilience itself correlates or differ with objective resilience measures. This is the second part that will be presented in the last slide of my presentation. And it's very much important to understand how a subjective measure of resilience, directly resilience, can correlate or differ again from an objective measure. So remaining on the first part, the resilience definition is always the same. There are a bunch of aspects that are important that need to be included in the resilience measurement. things like aspiration, motivation, and expectations, and things like social capital. Since the first time that I started doing resilience analysis in 2009, I realized, and we discussed it in FAO, and we discussed it also with our friends and colleagues here, how difficult it was to properly measure the social capital, the social networks. It's something that we have, first, many difficulties in understanding, and second, many difficulties in capturing. And being a quantitative nerd and a quantitative addicted, I didn't even consider the possibility of using qualitative. And then we started understanding that was the only way we could somehow try to understand. Because it's very difficult to understand things like the real social capital a household can rely on. It's something which is absolutely difficult to plug into a quantitative analysis. And this is this was coming from another list of exercises that we did also, for example, with Dan Maxwell in Sudan, where we were trying to capture things like the institutional enabling environment. There are a number of biases in this type of measures because, of course, for example, when we did this exercise in South Sudan, we didn't manage to get a large number of answers because people were just frightened of answering and saying, no, the institutional environment is around me is not supporting me, is not supporting my household, but they just didn't want to say. So it's even more difficult. Even if we open this important window, that is the qualitative subjective measure or quantitative subjective measure, we still have difficulties in capturing the right information. So we need to do much practice, and do many exercises in order to get the right information. What did we do? We developed together with ODI a module on perceived well-being and social inclusion. So asking questions on how the household see itself in terms of the social network, in terms of well-being. So 3 indicators: perception of social inclusion and decision-making process, perception of social inclusion in local service provision, and subjective measure. And we have included this in RIMA, not directly in the estimation of RIMA, but we have used it as exogenous. This evidence is referred to 2 datasets, one capturing the Triangle of Hope in Mauritania and another one capturing the region of Matam in Senegal. The 2 datasets are quite comparable because we've been using the same questionnaire, which is an LSMS type, but is still adapted to the needs of RIMA. We did everything, so since from the beginning, from the training to the data collection itself, and finally we arrived to these results. So for the first question is on social well-being. We did not do any regression because in the estimation of RIMA there are, although it is a structural regression model, but there are, however, some well-being indicators, so we cannot make it a regression to avoid the problem of endogeneity. So this is just a sort of correlation to see whether those households who are perceiving themselves with a very low value of subjective well-being were also scored to a lower or higher level of resilience capacity index. And as you may see, the higher they perceive themselves in terms of well-being, the higher it was also the resilience capacity index. So this is just a very basic correlation analysis, seeing whether the 2 indicators are going in the same direction, which is not saying much, but it's starting to say something. The second aspect is in perception of social inclusion and resilience capacity. In this case, there was not endogeneity problem, so we could run a regression analysis. And again, even in this case, you may see that there is a positive effect in the social, in one of the 2 indicators of social inclusion, in the Triangle of Hope, so Mauritania, and in both in Triangle of Hope and Matam for the decision-making process, meaning that households that feel themselves like being part of the social decision process feel themselves also better with a greater resilience, which is of course intuitive, but it is still an evidence that needs to be created. On the second aspect, on the second part of the work that we are doing now, that is to say, on the research of how perceived resilience can be correlated, can interact with an objective measure of resilience like RIMA, like any other objective indicator of resilience, we developed this 2 phases research plan with ODI, including also our friends from Braced. Phase 1 will be just looking at how the two measures correlate. So what we did for Mauritania, what we did for Senegal, we will be doing for this indicator of perceived resilience. In this module developed by ODI, there are 3 specific questions for a shock, like shock specific on drought, and there are 10 questions which are not shock specific. So they create a very I would say a very basic index of subjective resilience. We collected this in module in 13 data sets. In some cases, there are also panel data, so we can compare over time how it is changing. In one specific case, which I don't remember now, but there is also shock in the between, so it's a very interesting exercise for us to go in and check. And we will see initially how it correlates. So whether this subjective measure of resilience correlates or differ from the objective, or at least tentatively objective measure of resilience called RIMA. The phase 2 will be seeking to factor as you may have seen, RIMA has 4 key pillars: access to basic services, adaptive capacity, social safety nets, and assets. And we will try to add a 5th element, which will be will be subjective resilience. So how I see myself if I think that I will be more able to resist and to adapt. And this will create a lot of evidence upon which we hope over in next 1 year to arrive to a point where we can have some concrete examples. And I close here. Sorry for exceeding the time.
Excellent. No, you said Thanks, Marco. You said actually within the 10 minutes that was allocated to you, so we've absolutely no problem. I would like to invite Ali Mayu now to talk about their work on aspiration. This one, right? No, this one. Yes. Try to stay in 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chris. In the next 10 minutes, I would like to summarize some of the questions and findings of a 5-year field experiment that focuses on aspirations in the context of Ethiopia. So that's why the name has long run in it. I would like to also say that this research has been partly funded by USAID and DFID. So on behalf of the team, I would like to thank those that support. So the motivation for this research was not resilience explicitly when we started it. It was based on the observation that poor people in developing countries fail to make investments that clearly produce high returns and appear to modify their future. Why is this the case was the first question. And related to this observation or evidence, there's also evidence that people have beliefs, form beliefs that seem to restrain what they think of themselves and their capacities. I give one example here, for instance. These are statements made by vulnerable people in Ethiopia describing their life. It's a life of no thought for tomorrow. We have neither a dream nor an imagination. So this kind of helplessness about what they can do seems to create some limitation about their effort, investment, and other activities to modify their future. And again, as Chris said, some people relate to this or describe this as fatalism and so on. We took a different tack and assume that or ask whether aspirations are an important element in this story. So The question we started with are these two you see on the slide. Are low aspirations a possible explanation to this observation, to this fact that a lot of poor people do not make the right investments? And if so, is it possible to change aspirations, not temporarily, but in a stable or a sustained manner? I think this is the right point to define aspirations, at least for the purpose of this research. Psychologists, social psychologists in particular, have defined aspirations as forward-looking goals or targets. And for those of us who are inclined to be economists, this can be described in terms of preferences, and one can think of aspirations as end states or boundary preferred states. I want to be an engineer, I want to be rich, and you can think of all sorts of ultimate objectives that people attach themselves to. Why are aspirations important? In principle, there are two reasons. Again, this has been discussed at different points during this workshop. One, they motivate behavior. They provide guidance to action, including investments that people engage in. Second, they are not the same. They are not uniform. Everybody does not have the same aspirations. So they motivate behavior, and because they are different, they could lead to different responses and ultimately different outcomes. So how did we do our research? There are, in this kind of research, maybe generally, there are two questions: measurement and identification. This is a simplified picture of doing research. In this specific sense, in this specific context, we need to measure aspirations. And what we adopt is design of a survey instrument that covers 4 domains relevant to characterizing aspirations. These 4 domains are income, wealth, social status, and children's education. And in each of these, we ask people to specify 4 levels. The first is their current state. Second is the state that they would like to achieve. The third is the state they think they can achieve. And the third and the fourth ones are the minimum and maximum levels of the state in their communities. So that is what we use for measurement. Identification is an important problem here because both aspirations and choices are interlinked. In the more technical term, they are endogenous to each other. And a person, for instance, may have high aspirations because he is successful, or a person may be successful because she had higher aspirations. So to separate this, you need a shock that would affect one without affecting directly the other. And what we have here is an aspirational shock in the form of role model documentaries of Ethiopian farmers who succeeded without significant support from others, and these are the core of the intervention. And I would like to highlight that no other intervention is involved in the experiment, no incentives in one way, no material support to make certain things feasible, or no specific information or advice embedded in the documentaries to help people make choices. So it's a pure aspirational shock. The treatment is invitation to watch these role model documentaries. I cannot say much about this design, so I'll run through these quickly. Then, because the study is in a remote district of Ethiopia, the event of screening may itself cause some impact. So to control for that, we have a placebo in the form of an entertainment program, and we have 2 control groups. The first is surveyed within the treatment villages. They are not invited to the screening of either the treatment or the placebo. And the third is a pure control group outside of these study villages, and the survey occurred 5 years later. Timeline. We have treatment, placebo and within control villages, baseline 2010, follow-up 2011, end line 2015-16, pure control group in 2015 and 16. I have a brief table summarizing the sample, 84 villages in total, 64 treatment and 20 pure villages, and about 3,000 households, individuals altogether. Key findings. So the findings I report here is comparing yes, this is the last slide. Comparing the treated groups, those who watched the screening, with pure controls from the villages where nothing of that sort happened related to the study, 5 years after the screening. 5 years after the screening. So we observe aspirations and expectations, particularly relevant to children's education, improving, in the sense that they are higher for the treated group by 10% and 13% respectively, relative to the pure control group 5 years after the intervention. So aspirations and expectations were changed, and changed in a persistent manner. Then we have significant changes in future-oriented behavior, which could be, as I said, there are no other additional influences, additional interventions, so they can reasonably be rigorously associated with the intervention. Children enrollment and spending in particular is a major area of change. 20% more children are enrolled by the treated villagers than the pure controls, and they spend 40% more on their children's education. They also invest in agricultural inputs more, and they accumulate assets, again, more than the pure control group. I would like to add two things. First, observe that all these are from a low base. So although the rates are very high, these people are still poor people. So the base is, you'll have your chance.
Were the parents literate or illiterate at the beginning?
This is, yeah. And second, there are spillover effects. That means, in fact, this impact could be even larger if we focus to the total effect, because even those control group within the treatment villages have higher children enrollment and investment. I think we said enough about resilience and aspirations. I thought I would have something to say, but I think maybe I'm preaching to the choir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anima, staying within the time, exactly 10 minutes. I'd like to invite Tim without wasting more time, and then, yes, please, we'll have plenty of, we have sufficient time for question after.
Okay, so mine's going to be similar to what, I want to say one thing. Back in 2007, I was working with Alamaya over here when we first started looking at aspirations. And we wanted to see, we were doing one of the first resilience studies I'd engaged in Ethiopia, and we were trying to see if the villages where we thought we found more people that were resilient actually had different types of aspirations than those that we didn't. And so our first clues from the analysis that we were doing was that this was an important issue to be looking at. And so that really inspired us to make sure that we include this in all of our surveys. And then having a psychologist also working with us actually helped us refine and look more carefully at some of these indicators and some of the concepts that we should be working on. And of course, Chris has been a big fan of this stuff as well. I'm not going to go into these definitions again, because I think that the past speakers have already said this, but we were looking at risk perception, we were looking at self-efficacy and aspirations in our work, and we were trying to see if these different psychosocial factors made a difference. So I'm going to present data from a baseline survey that we did in Ethiopia, the first recurrent monitoring survey that we did, and then the second recurrent monitoring survey we did And then finally, the work that we've been working on in West Africa with RISE, in Burkina Faso and Niger. So one of the things that we were looking at, these are pastoral groups, Borana and Somalis in Ethiopia. And what we found was people that felt that they had a higher sense of control over their own life seemed to be less likely to engage in negative coping strategies than people that felt like they had less control. So this was an important finding, because what we found was that people that did engage in those negative coping strategies were actually, it was going to be much harder for them to recover from the drought, because they were pulling their kids out of school, so they were affecting their human capital. They were getting into huge debt, so it was going to be hard for them to get out of that. And they were also selling off all their productive assets. So it was difficult for them to recover, but people that felt like they had more self-control, holding for wealth, holding for all of these household characteristics, people that felt like they had more self-control actually did better. We also found that the level of self-efficacy has a positive and statistically significant relation with recovery. So those people that feel like they're in control actually recover faster than those that don't. So what this really suggests is that perceptions that people have that their level of control over their own life is positively correlated with their ability to recover from shocks and stressors. You know, I think if you can just turn and ask yourself this question. When you feel like you are determined and you really think you can do stuff on your own, you actually tend to perform better than if you're really depressed and you think everything's against you. So, you know, I always try to use these concepts on myself, and I try to think, well, does this really hold for me too? And I think it does. We also, in the recurrent monitoring, again, just to remind you that haven't been a part of these other presentations, recurrent monitoring uses a panel set of data. We're looking at data over time. And what we found that aspirations and the confidence to adapt really made a difference in people's resilience to drought. It helped them prevent from selling and slaughtering their livestock and consuming their seed stock too soon. It also helped them seek out formal assistance faster than those people that actually weren't engaged. Now, in some of the other studies I've shown is that when you have this kind of humanitarian assistance that comes early, it makes a huge difference in helping people keep their assets, helping people not turn to these negative coping strategies. We also found that in the survey we did, the second round of the RMS2, that these aspirations, again, prevented households from selling or slaughtering their livestock. So this is after 2 years of significant drought. Okay, so it wasn't just the first drought, it was the second big drought that El Nino hit, that they were still, with these aspirations, really making a difference. Okay, so then we also wanted to look at what was going on in West Africa with the RISE program. And this is an agro-pastoral area with marginal agriculture. They've experienced all kinds of shocks, both drought, erratic rainfall, insect and bird invasions. And what we found was that households' aspirations and their confidence to adapt had a positive association with their food security and their ability to recover. So what was interesting about this is here we are in East Africa, and we're finding that these psychosocial factors are making a difference. And now we're in West Africa, and we're starting to see the same thing. So I just want to give a plug for those of you who are engaged in resilience measurement, that these psychosocial factors really make a difference. And one of the things that's been nice about our research is that sometimes we underplay how important this stuff is. And this intangible, as Chris calls them, measures are really significant. And I think we need to get better at it, and we have to recognize that there are cultural differences from one place to another, but I think this is something worth exploring and getting better at collecting. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, as well. I mean, I was impressed by the fact that you managed to present.
What's that?
I was impressed by the fact that you managed to present within 5 minutes, so that's very good. That's give us plenty of time for actually having now people in the audience. I've seen people scrubbing frantically, so I'm assuming there is plenty of questions. I would like us to get the big picture question. I think if we do have some technical aspect, we probably can catch up those guys during lunch, I will be, I think, more inspired by question around, what are the implications of those results from a programmatic perspective, for instance. So I open the floor. Who want to start? Okay, Jenny?
Hi, do you guys have that data disaggregated by gender and age? We know CRS did research that shows that literacy has had a phenomenal effect on improving women's aspirations. I'm curious as to how that changes with age, and if they have information on what works more for women and what works more for men. I think that's interesting for me.
Next. Can we take three and then we try to answer those?
Yeah.
Please, gentlemen.
Yeah, I was really struck. I work on the RISE program. I'd love to put this into our program, and so I'm curious. We have one example of showing role models, and I'm wondering if you or anyone else in the audience have other examples of practical interventions we could do that could address this, or ways that we change our programs to build aspirations into them.
Very good. Andrew?
Tim, Andrew Shepherd. I'm just wondering how much understanding of the reasons for variation in self-efficacy, control, aspirations, etc. Have you been able to get at? Were you able to do kind of in-depth qualitative work as part of this? Thank you.
Can we try to answer those first three and then we carry on with the other ones?
Okay, do you want to go first? Or you want to go first?
Thank you very much. To respond to the education question and the gender and age also. I have to. Okay. So this is a randomized controlled trial. The key first effort is to make your different groups, comparable groups, reflect the various characteristics of the population. So a specific characters, like for instance, whether in each group, if you like, the same kind of literacy rates would prevail as the comparable group. So at the baseline. So that is, and then you conduct different comparisons to make sure that that is the case. In terms of programming, I just briefly would say that the core for resilience programming should focus obviously on opportunities that you generally do improve this domain or that domain or this asset or that asset. So in my view, these psychosocial ones, play a complementary role in the sense that they enhance the efficacy of these programs if they are promoted properly. Of course, this could go beyond that also, but I'm thinking in terms of programming only. Having people that are positive about themselves is an end in itself, because it creates all sorts of socioeconomic dynamics that is beneficial. So it is, in my view, combining these opportunities interventions with aspirational or psychosocial interventions would be great. And we have a great example here in GRAD, was led by John Meyer. So any practical advice, I suggest talk to John. Thanks.
Well, I'd like to say one thing. Alamayo didn't talk about aspiration windows, but what we basically mean by aspiration windows is you're trying to find examples of people that actually you aspire to be like. So sometimes people have aspiration windows that are totally unrealistic, like I can never be Elvis Presley, but
you have the shoes.
But sometimes you can have too narrow of an aspiration window, so if your neighbor has one more chicken than you do and that's all you want to be like, then that's not going to really make you more resilient either. So what we're trying to do is look for opportunities to expand people's aspiration window so that they actually can see people just like them with the same set of resources, the same set of constraints, actually doing something that actually is making a difference. So creating those opportunities either through like videos or going to other villages and visiting, this kind of stuff. Marco, you want to say anything?
Well, I can say something on the gender. It's absolutely interesting. We are working at a paper on measuring resilience and gender. So trying to understand the different dynamics on how this can be twisted in the resilience estimation. Because it's very tough issue, no? Because there are many different angles through which you can look at this. You can see, you can check. We already do disaggregation analysis. We already do this disaggregate analysis based on, for example, female-headed household rather than male-headed household. Within the female-headed household, we disaggregate into de jure and de facto female-headed. So those who are just widow, for example, or those who are living alone but they have the husband somewhere else. So we have quite intensively working with the gender division and the gender expert here in the US. But, for example, a dynamic that we still don't capture and we are looking forward at capturing is how it changes in the behavior of the household members within the household. So, you know, and by this point of view, we are planning to undergo I don't remember whether 2 or 3 data collections specifically looking at the time use and at other specific questions like who is managing, you know, a credit, who is managing the land, who is taking the final decision on something, whether it is the female, the woman, or the man, and so far, in order to broaden our capacity of doing this type of analysis.
Okay, we're going to take another set of questions. Let's try to keep both the question and the answer crisp and focus.
Hi, I'm Elena Zefilippi from the Committee on Sustainability Assessment. I have a question for Tim. I think that there is a subjectiveness in the identification of the coping strategies as well. So what I mean is that for you, a coping strategy can be negative. For me, it can be negative, but less negative, for example. So my question is, should we also capture perception around the degree of negativeness of coping strategies, or let's call it severity of coping strategies?
Thanks, Dr. Alamayu, for referring to our project. We have a component called Aspiration to Graduation, so it's specifically on can you leave the safety net and survive? And role models, successful graduates coming in and giving testimony is important there. But I wanted to make a comment about the kind of aspirational window. And there's a factor beyond, you know, someone's own imagination and view of the future, and that's kind of social norms and religious convictions as obstacles. And just a couple cases where one of the ethnic groups we work with, saving for the future was considered like an affront to God or an insult. You know, that's the source of your future, not your own actions. And then gender participation, which is key to what we do. Social norms just were entirely opposed to these things. And we had success in making changes. And I think the reason was that it was easier than we expected, is because prior to that, no one was actually working on these ideas. You know, the local kind of support structure accepted the social and cultural norms as much as the community did. So it required some external change agent, new ideas to get things moving.
Very good, thanks.
Hi, Sean Wozniak from Burkina Faso. Also working on Rise with Jennifer and Patrick. This is awesome. This really is. I mean, this
yeah.
is. I mean, it's very, very exciting, and I think it could unlock a lot of maybe kind of a hesitance in our beneficiaries to actually go forward and strive more. One of the things I think we see in Burkina Faso, and this will lead me to a question, and I would totally love to work with you guys to come up with different ways that we could possibly program in Burkina Faso to see if we can get this to work. But one of the things that we see that I think affects a large percent of the beneficiaries in terms of achieving their agency is that there's this reliance on the government and social safety nets. And part of this is because of where they are and the recurrent shocks, and that's what's there to help them and not the private sector. But I also think that whether they realize it or not, that's holding them back a little bit in some of the value chain work that we're doing, or livelihoods diversification and so on. And so I wonder if you've seen across, this brings to the question, I'm sorry, I'm doing one of those questions I hate, where it's all loaded up front, but I wonder if you've seen across regions, or across countries even, if you've seen this, and if it's different between like French colonies and English colonies or countries that were never colonized, like where does this come from, and how do we actually just unlock it so that people realize it's not either or, it's not public or private, it's actually like both. You know, you can rely on the public, and you should be striving to be a private sector agent, and so on.
Very naughty question indeed. Let's try to see if those guys have some comments.
French guy and an Italian guy, Somalia.
Do you guys want to react or comment on some of those?
I was serious, by the way. I'll answer the first question. When we look at coping strategies, we're looking at both positive and negative coping strategies. And so we try to, so one of the things we've noticed is that people that tend to be more resilient, have higher aspirations, higher feeling of self-control, they are more likely to engage in more of the positive coping strategies. But there's a point where, you know, that resistance kind of wears down, and so if the shock is continuing, and then you have all these downstream effects, like in the Barana region, these people are very proud people, and they're very used to taking care of themselves, not relying on others to take care of them. But eventually, their ability to do that gets eroded because they've just been hammered over and over and over again by the multiple shocks. And so maybe at first they're able to not turn to those things, but eventually they turn to them because they've used up all of their capacities to actually manage the stuff. So, you know, I think Tiffany was getting at this, I don't know if it was yesterday or yeah, it was yesterday. When you first do a survey and you actually identify two ethnic groups, and you're saying, okay, this ethnic group seems to be more resilient than that other ethnic group in this region, it doesn't mean they're going to stay that way, because of the severity of the shocks that they're exposed to can make a huge difference. And so that's why resilience is such a dynamic concept. You have to understand it in relationship to the context that we're working in. Do you want to answer Sean's question?
Okay, that's a big question. Two observations. First, as you outlined, history and culture matters to these things. Who we are, to a large extent, is determined by the context our personalities were formed, the communities in which we grew up, and so on and so forth. Second, as Tim highlighted, circumstances determine also our capacity to hold certain beliefs and act upon them. In fact, one of the key observations about poverty and aspirations is that poverty reduces the ability to aspire, and this means that both poverty and inequality are sustained or perpetuated. So in terms of the specific question you asked, the repeated exposure to shocks and the provision of support from external sources may create what appears to be a dependency state. So these households appear to wait for external support, not do things that they would have done before, as Tim described, or that seems to be obvious. So an important role to these kind of psychosocial interventions is to try to unlock, to try to trigger realization that there is a possibility to make gain. In this regard, I'd like to highlight one final point, and that is we usually talk about opportunities. We don't talk about that is a very good focus, correct focus. But there are two things that we have to complement that with. First, existing opportunities may not be exploited for a variety of reasons, including those we are talking about. Second, opportunities are created. They are not always given, or they are not always static. So poor people can create opportunities under the right circumstances. Thanks.
You had something? Yes, please. I want to react to your point. I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, John. Okay, so to what you were mentioning, John, which to me it's very much important. I think that in terms of unlocking, we are also unlocking other very important norms, other very important aspects of resilience, which we are just starting digging into. No? Things like social norms, culture, religious aspects, those are key, and those are actually, for sure, playing a major role, especially in some very poor countries, in poor areas, in depressed areas, where even more this type of dynamics can act. I will always remember the first time that I went in the field was in India, was not in Africa, and we were running an exercise on Parkarakoli, which was one of the lowest casta in the community. And every time that we went in the village interviewing some Parkarakoli, there were some other people from another casta, which I don't remember the name, just passing by, and the Parkarakoli flew away, terrified. So this is just to say, I'm not saying we should not go and look at this, but we have to find the special ways for doing this, and that's not for sure a quantitative analysis, but maybe this is one of the many aspects where qualitative analysis can help us achieving a better understanding of these dynamics, and then it is up to us as analysts, as economists, as analysts in general, finding a way to plug into the resilience measurement tool that we want to implement.
Okay, very good. We got time for one or very max two questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Thomas. I work for the World Bank on a large program in the Sahel that supports governments to implement a package of interventions, that one of which is directly inspired by Alemayu's work in Ethiopia, which is a video-based intervention for psychosocial support, and that will be rolled out across the region for hundreds of thousands of safety net beneficiaries, with the idea of unlocking those psychosocial constraints. And I just wanted to point out that this has been really important work for programming. My question is, though, to get there, we had to lead pretty new, a new form of dialogue with governments on issues that they typically don't really want to think about. There is widespread misunderstanding of what psychology or mental health is in developing countries. And my question is, have you been involved in that kind of dialogue, and what kind of resistance have you faced for integrating this dimension into government programs? To be honest, in the Sahel it's been a little easier than we thought, and I think John's comment is actually true, that you just need to get it started, and actually building coalitions and finding champions for that kind of work was easier than I thought, but still you're up against resistance. So.
Okay, one more question, lady just in front.
Actually, that was the main focus of my question as well, but just to add on that, what mechanisms, if you have been talking to governments, what mechanisms have you found have been useful to show them how they can start integrating some of this, largely because I'm from BRAC, and we work largely with graduation, and the element of coaching is something that unlocks some of the psychosocial transformation, so I'm interested in hearing about mechanisms you worked with governments on.
So, one last one, huh?
Mike. Mic is
Carry
not
on,
working.
carry on. Sorry, your time is up. No, I'm kidding.
Talk really fast.
Well, thank you for the question.
I'm also interested in this question of, what can we as implementing agencies do to increase this aspiration? And so my question is related to if anybody's looked at sort of the correlation between social capital and this whole concept of aspiration, because we do have some experience and evidence of increasing social capital, especially if we take the expanded definition of social capital to include the sense of belonging and trust. Just curious if you'd looked at that.
Okay, very good question. So please, just very, very straight to the point so that we can wrap up in time.
Yeah, so my experience with the countries, they are quite proactive, also especially in Sahel and also by the other African countries, they are very proactive. I can mention a couple of examples where they were telling me it is very much important that you guys capture social capital. So I have not been facing particular difficulties in factoring. My problem is to get the right data. So my problem is to find the right tool for getting the right information. Which omits the biases and different difficulties. If I get to the point, that would be easier.
Very good. Tim or Halimai?
Okay. Speaking with governments, actually, a lot of governments would be excited because this is one simple sounding intervention that could bring about a lot of significant change. Obviously, the challenge of course is to design actual programs that would incorporate that. There is some development in Ethiopia, for instance, as John knows, introducing it as part of the PSNP and so on. Some elements, given grad success, shows that it is possible to do that. And in terms of social capital and aspirations, perhaps Tim's intervention about aspiration window has a bridge between the two. Aspiration window is a cognitive world that you are familiar with, and that obviously would be linked with your social capital. So therefore, that window could be conceptual as well as empirically a link between the two. Thanks.
Okay, so I think Tim is going to offer me the chance to wrap up.
Just a plug for Chris. Chris has been working on a paper that we've actually made available as a resource, and Tiffany, Chris, and I are still trying to get published in a journal. But the paper lays out a very important subjective resilience framework that I think would be useful for everybody to take a look at. And what it tries to do is look at both how people's self-control, self-efficacy relates to also the other assets and capacities that people have, and how the combination of those two things have a lot to do with the kinds of responses that people actually make using those capacities. So this is where the two come together, and I think is really an important part of making sure your measurement framework understands that connection, and you're trying to capture those dimensions when you're measuring resilience.
Very good. So in 30 seconds, I'm going to wrap up. I think that is an inspired session. I'm sure that if we have next year meetings, it's not going to be just 30 of us, but 200, because that's a key element in understanding what resilience is about. Thanks for the panel to be in time and to answer. Thanks for the questions. Please continue discussion. I think this is a critical moving forward in the pushing the frontier of understanding resilience. Thank you very much.